Hey everyone. Big news in the world of apologetics. Joe Schmid, from his channel known as Majesty of Reason, has converted from agnosticism into Catholicism. He has become a Christian, and not even just a Christian in general, specifically a Catholic Christian. And to me, anyways, this is some of the biggest news that's happened in this space in a while, as far as I can tell. My name's Gabriel, by the way. I'm sure many of you might not know who I am. It's because I'm not much of anybody. I used to pop up in a video here or there with some people who were creating content about apologetics, theism, and atheism. But limited expert background. I went to a ministry school that I would not recommend anybody go to, and then graduated from there. Came from a background of charismatic Christianity. But before then and after then, caring about these kinds of arguments and discussions has just been an incredibly important part of my life. It's really interesting. As someone who's been around since the 2000s and the way the YouTube landscape has changed, new atheism was definitely trending, so to speak. And it's funny to see how that is really not the case anymore. And basically how, over the years, content about apologetics has kind of diverged. I would argue in general it's just probably not as popular as it used to be. And it's a lot of it's diverged into making kind of popular content or content about low-hanging fruit. And then highly philosophical, where it's, a lot of the content is engaging with published academic philosophy, and this is kind of where I got introduced to Joe Schmid. I don't think he'd be offended by this. He's obviously not very old. He I think was first making content. He wasn't in graduate school just yet. I could be wrong on that, actually. But the point being is he's someone who's been very, very engaged. When he's talking about arguments from motion and Aristotle, he's getting into territory I think that most of us would say that we'd be in over our heads about. And so I remember I have a lot of fond memories thinking of Joe Schmid and his content, frankly. I think over the last few years, he's probably the person I would have mentioned the most in discussions and flat out, arguing with people online, of someone who would be making points that would be critical of Christian arguments, frankly. So in that sense, I always respect him. I definitely have had my disagreements with him over the years. And some of these things are things that I still struggle with, but, things about, moral realism, the way that he takes the argument from perfection, and where he kind of thinks through that was kind of created by Josh Rasmussen. Some of his points about fine-tuning and psychophysical harmony. But all in all, man, he's just created a lot of solid work over the years. So when I heard the news initially, I have to admit that I think the first thing when you have somebody who you have looked up to have something like this is possibly to get a little defensive. And so I had to fight that back a little bit there. There's a part of me who, as someone who still, to this day, has trouble, accepting and has a hard time just kind of holding true a lot of arguments made by different apologists and people in the philosophy of religion that are in support of Christianity. I still struggle with that to this day. Part of my journey has been that I've tried to become a Christian again, as someone who definitely deconstructed basically 9-10 years ago now, but for very practical reasons, is try to come back to the faith, and one way of actually dealing with mental health issues out of all things. But it's still something that's not come easy. There's times where I'm just like, I can't believe this. So basically, when someone like Joe Schmid kind of has this thing, part of me, it's, some of those old tropes again, which I think they come to mind because there's not like a 0% possibility, that, Joe Schmid is sold out, to Catholic YouTube, for the money and all that good stuff. But I think the big thing I want to point out is I think myself and a lot of people like Joe Schmid, the content he's created over the years, is we really do care about these arguments. This material does matter. There's a lot of people who apologetics is a thing that interests them, but their faith, for the most part, is fairly disconnected from it. And I don't think that's been the case with Joseph Schmid or people like myself and a lot of people engaging this kind of content. So I wanted to cover this because I think it's kind of a big deal. I think what's very interesting is a lot of his stuff. It's some of the very little content that I've created on YouTube. I've engaged with some of the people that he was referencing, Caleb Jackson talking about, and not just him, there's other people that he mentioned that have been discussing basically miracle claims within specifically a Catholic context. And that's always resonated with me, which is why I made videos on that stuff, because I come from a independent, charismatic background. Miracles were an incredibly important part of our everyday faith. Believing that God was working, that the Spirit was at work. And frankly, I think it's a perspective that a lot of people in this space, especially on the more philosophical side of people creating content about apologetics, oftentimes don't get, or they don't understand I think with the surgence of Catholic YouTube, a lot more familiarity is coming from Catholic content creators and what it's like to be maybe within a Catholic context. And that's one of the areas that I'm hoping maybe Joe Schmid will get to explore over the years. Because one thing that was pretty big about this is a lot of times Joe focuses very much so, not necessarily a bad thing, just kind of on the arguments themselves and not as much on how his personal faith journey over the years, and why he's interested in all this stuff. And he got to show a bit of his personal side with this video talking about how he's converted. He's talked a little bit about that. I remember a video of his about, scared about what his family was thinking, not knowing what his current beliefs were and stuff. So it's not like he's never engaged with that stuff. But I am curious to hear more. He talked a little bit about certain saints' stories and how that's kind of helped him on a personal level. I think specifically what resonated with me the most is he talked about, after hearing this stuff, he kind of put himself in the position of, what if I'm going to stand in front of my maker one day? And what would I have to say of myself if I saw all of this stuff and then kind of rejected it? And that resonates with me. And actually, maybe one of the areas I was kind of critical of him. I remember some interviews he's had in the past with Liz Jackson, who's someone who's kind of defending modern versions of Pascal's wager. And that's something that was a bit of a sore spot for me, but it's also one of the things that's kind of been a driving factor in the practical reasons why I've been trying to engage with my faith again, within Christianity, identifying as a Christian. There is this real rubber meets the road kind of thought of what happens if we're really talking about the eternal stakes of I might be eternally separated from God, and depending on how reasonable you find certain depictions of hell, it could be a very, very unpleasant experience over, say, just an unpleasant experience, but at least I'm not being burned or tortured eternally or something like that. And actually, I hope that's an area that Joe Schmid gets to talk into. I think within the Catholic tradition, there's definitely some people who are sympathetic towards universalism, let's put it that way. Perhaps mostly just hopeful universalists, but someone who's not Catholic per se, but is within this older church tradition. David Bentley Hart, has kind of gone into some of these issues. So I'm curious because one of the things that Joe talks about, that he still struggled with, are things like the problem of evil and stuff, and I think that the problem of hell directly relates to that. So this is definitely a big thing that's happened. And I guess I mentioned that part of me wanted to be kind of critical of him, but kind of getting into my life story a little bit, my life was all about this stuff. And one of the reasons why I had a sore spot with him and Liz Jackson it felt like the video they were doing was kind of a bit of a game. This is just some interesting philosophical argument that's just kind of cool to talk about. And it's like, yeah, we're not talking about, eternal stakes. We're not talking about the possibility of eternal torture. we're not talking about things that would massively change the way that you live your everyday life. But now Joe is kind of in the thick of it a little bit, and I'm looking forward to. He says that he's going to be making, an interview with Matt Fradd. I'm sure he's going to be doing going on an interview circuit, so to speak, with a few different YouTubers, probably. A little bit more on the personal side of faith, because I'll admit I'm very curious about that. But getting back to some of the things that convinced him, were these things about miracles, and so I'm curious, if he is willing to say, if he's now more, he's less skeptical of other sort of paranormal, supernatural claims, of alien sightings and stuff like that. I'm curious if in general he feels like he needs to be more open to those things, and how that relates to why he thinks, Christianity in particular maybe is a view that he adopts rather than some sort of more general supernatural in which there's this very strong element involved within the Christian faith in which supernatural events are occurring in that context. And maybe he would say yes, but he just happens to find the Christian explanation to be the best explanation. I could see that. I'd love him to get more involved with what he thinks about fine-tuning and psychophysical harmony, because I am curious specifically, there's been one of the more pervasive, I think, elements of apologetics content in the more, I guess I would say, more philosophical realm has been stuff related to consciousness, and specifically how it's not reducible to the physical. And I think what's interesting with that for me, which is I think you kind of need psychophysical harmony then to make the case that the world that we have is better explained by God. Because if consciousness is this kind of its own separate thing and isn't required on these complex physical structures, I would say consciousness is actually fairly simple. And so how surprising is it that conscious beings would exist on alternatives to Christian theism? It seems to me then that is nowhere near as unlikely given chance than, say, all the physical structures you would need to create physical life, in which then you have embodied consciousness, but you don't need to have embodied consciousness, I think, on most forms of theism and Christian theism. So I'm curious about that. I would love to hear him talk about how he views hell, and then I think some of the moral questions. I think it's interesting he talked about the magisterium, so I think the role of that would be really interesting to talk about. How comfortable he feels disagreeing with church tradition, and the declarations of popes and stuff like that. If he can maybe believe that, it's possible this can change in the future because different declarations have changed over time. How much he's willing to bite the bullet on moral issues, and that's been one of the biggest struggles for me. As someone who gets involved in my faith, I've been trying to do that more. I've been getting more involved in Christian churches and Christian communities. And the tough thing is, there's generally speaking a more conservative, more Republican kind of approach to a lot of moral issues. And while I'm more sympathetic to the issue of the pro-life position, I think Joe has definitely, given his content in the past, I think things about people who are gay, I think is definitely something that's tough for me. Certain ways of maybe rearing children, and how much of that he thinks is healthy within a Christian context. And this might be more of my personal background. I came from a very, very sheltered, homeschooled background. And basically, and still struggled with faith, frankly, until I was around 15 or so. But that was something that's like, I feel like, given the option of whether I would like people to be raised the way I was raised or another way, even from a Christian perspective, I have a hard time kind of buying into that. And so, yeah, part of me wants to be more critical of Joe, much more critical, think that, there's all of these great intellectuals he can be a part of, and creating great intellectual content, from a Christian perspective. And that could be very alluring. But then I have to admit that there's things about Christianity that have drawn me back to it. Like, there's parts of me, even with all of these moral questions, just from a very personal level, with the way that my life has gone, that would want Christianity to be true because I feel like it would make my life feel better. I went through a very tough divorce. And I think him sharing and engaging with others, and because I think the personal element is something I'm curious about more, because I've gotten to points in my life where, I'd be praying to God where it's like life sometimes seems to get so tough that, you pray for God to take you home early. And that's not a fun place to be in. But it's one of those things where faith is a very, very personal matter, not just a matter of arguments. And yet these arguments still matter. These two things are true at the same time. And as someone who has been struggling lately with trying to maintain faith with all these intellectual holdups that I have, there's the personal side of me is wondering, if there's a timing and a reason for this happening that could maybe resonate with me a little bit more. And so taking time to set aside maybe my more critical side of my mind for a moment, there's a part of me that very much resonates with his story. And the moments of relief I have had in the past from faith, even though those moments oftentimes don't sustain. So I guess what I want to say to Joe is, given the little bit I just shared about this, and some of the issues that I have, it's just that I find within Christian faith, and given my background, the trauma that I've experienced in my own life, there's such a way in which we can get hyper focused on all these details and stuff. Like I mentioned divorce, right? And I remember my brother talking about, I think just in passing, he wasn't even trying to say something about, the biblical teachings on divorce and stuff like that. And just being like, I might be in a place where I could never get married again or something like that because of these things, despite the fact that basically, even though I was trying to become a Christian, I was doing a very poor job at the time, and the complexities of the unhealthy relationship I was in. But the point being is that it relates to the fact that faith has very personal outcomes, and the stakes do matter on an individual level. And so at the individual level, what I want to say to Joe is, I really am hoping that this is bringing you a lot of joy, peace, some satisfaction in your personal life. I'm sure you yourself have been hung up on a lot of the specifics, and you probably are at a place where it's like it's the preponderance of evidence that's pushing you in this way rather than having answers on any given specific issue. I'm just hoping for the best for you, man. I'm definitely in a place now where I care a lot more about how people are doing in their personal life, regardless of faith. And so I am happy for you. I am looking forward to what the future looks like. I think it's quite clear at this point in time that atheism is definitely much more on the back foot when it comes to content being produced these days. And so I'm curious what the future is going to look like with this stuff there. I'm curious what Emerson Green is going to think about some of the stuff. I've had many disagreements with over the years as well, but someone who's been a bit more critical of theism. And so I'm just curious. I'm curious what the conversation is going to look like. I'm curious how people are going to engage with miracles. And then maybe he'll talk a little bit more about the case for the resurrection, and maybe just methods he uses to assess miracles. So it's kind of a big deal. I'm hoping in his personal life, and as well as the intellectual content we all care about, this is going to be a positive thing moving forward. So wishing for you the best for you, Joe. Hoping that other people will find this useful, or will find ways in which to continue to engage in this content and conversation. And hopefully I'll be talking with more of you in the future. Thanks, guys.